So this is my reading, commentary, reflection on chapter 26 of the Proverbs. Can't remember what part I'm in, but I'm on verse 22. Now I thought that I would share a thought or two just as an introduction to this thing, to get my mind warmed up and to ease us into it. Life is a funny thing. It's a funny thing to look back on and to reflect on. If one takes it upon themselves to engage with life and to keep the mind open, ready, active, on one hand it could be quite tiresome, perhaps even viewed as burdensome, but in another way, magical, mystical, miraculous. And I had, in such a short amount of time, today happens to be Monday, in a short amount of time I think I experienced a large range of emotions. This happens from time to time, but it happens to be a period of changing seasons now. Late September, early October. And there always is this shift in my experience of things as the weather changes, as the trees lose their leaves, as the weather gets colder. My feelings and my emotions are modified. They follow nature to a degree. And today, this morning, perhaps the changing seasons had accompanied this experience, but I had an experience that it happens every once in a while, where my mind will be in such a state, the state seemingly difficult to describe. At once I want to call it inattentive. At another I want to call it lacking, mistrusting, non-believing to a degree. There's a general dullness of experience, but even that doesn't quite characterize it, this bizarre feeling that happens upon me. It is unfortunate, in a way, that the mind can find itself doubting for no reason. The heart seems to take it upon itself to feel overwhelmed when it ought not to be. Now this is a bit different, I would say, from a typical anxiety. This is more of a longing, a sense of despair, almost as if one were to be destined to a particular sentence in prison, or perhaps of a working life, a particular way of life. And what's interesting about it is not necessarily the melancholic woe is me component, but rather the range that the mind goes through, because these feelings are often fleeting. They don't last more than a day if they happen. But there's always something that is wound up within the discipline, that is wound up within the practice, or maybe I should say a practice. This would be a practice that I consider, but I engage in other practices as well. But these practices ensure that my mind stays away from the misgivings that may be presented before the mind. words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. Now this is a verse that we've seen before in the Proverbs. How many times I'm uncertain. But this pattern is often seen, that a verse may be repeated, maybe not verbatim, but generally speaking, there will be a similarity in a verse. And it's always a pleasure to return to it, because in these situations I take it as emphasis. That we are seeing it again because we ought to be thinking about it again. Now chapter 26 is a chapter of the fool, is a chapter of the talebearer. It is a strong proverbial chapter to practice one's understanding of these symbols or topics. So like always, we're going to begin with the first half of the verse here. The words of a talebearer are as wounds. So we are tasked now with opening up a landscape, an image that we can see to understand something. So we are primarily tasked to consider how it is possible that information can cause a wound, and how a wound can be more than just physical. The words of a talebearer are as wounds. So in the last episode we talked a bit about the talebearer, about his character, about what exactly that means. So a talebearer, I think in the popular conception, is a person that spreads misinformation. They spread rumors, gossip. Perhaps it is untrue, perhaps it is partial truth given in a context that would set another mind down a different path than maybe the broader context would actually lead them. The talebearer often has unfortunate consequences. They can disrupt one's attention. They can lead one to madness. I'd like for a moment just to stay on this term, the talebearer. A Google definition says that the word tale is defined as a fictitious or true narrative or story, especially one that is imaginatively recounted. So much like the term pride, it's not really a simple matter. It's not always a negative thing. Of course, the broader term talebearer, I think, has cultural connotations to it. It has a direction to it, especially given the context of this verse. The talebearer is responsible for creating wounds. But I have to wonder, still, at this word tale, about the narrative, about the story, and about what the underlying substrate. This underlying substrate seems to me to be information, basic information. It's organized in such a way that means something to some agent. Now, what I find interesting is, I suppose, twofold. The condition in which the information can be false, and then the condition in which the information can be true. And this idea of absence, of negation, of an atheism, this is something that commonly is referred to in the Old Testament, in the Proverbs, in a particular manner, though. Often we come to it through the discussions of evil, or of wicked people, or of foolish people, of people that are mad, of people that have a poor ability to recognize phenomena in the environment, to incorporate information, to transmit information, to understand and to stabilize relationships, to stabilize their own individual identity. But this tale, and the possibility of it being fictitious, of not being real or true, strikes me as such an interesting thing, because that information, of course, it's something that is real, but it is an architecture. It is a scaffolding upon which the mind can walk. Now I can think, let's say on the side of a building, thinking physically that there is a scaffolding. I can recognize, based on certain things, certain inputs, certain types of information, that scaling the scaffolding would be acceptable because it exists at a particular place, a particular time. There's a particular structure that can support my weight. I can find myself at the edge of said scaffolding, and I could say to myself that the scaffolding continues, and yet I could step off of it and severely injure myself. Now, in both situations, information has been taken in, but only in one situation do we consider it to be a truthful representation of something. Now, putting aside physical reality, because of course we can have a narrative or even a fiction that is true in some way, that doesn't have a immediate underlying physical basin. Oftentimes the information that we store within our minds in the sense of the tale, it's almost a package of information. A network that is created perhaps to stabilize a memory or to stabilize our understanding of the world. A tale, at least in terms of my thinking at the moment, seems to be a bit of a translator. It takes information from the environment, but also created information from within the mind. It organizes it. It gives it some structure. It gives it a capacity to convey information in some larger sense. But one can easily imagine how many different ways a tale can be interpreted, it can be told, how important context is to its reception or its delivery. And in my mind, I struggle a little bit with this physical analogy. That everything, not that the physical world is somehow unimportant, that it's extremely important to our experience. But I certainly would not want to reduce our tales to that which is immediately perceivable by man's perception. Because, of course, there's much about the world that we don't understand, that we can't perceive, more importantly. There's much about the mind and where the mind may go, that it may find a truth somewhere that it did not experience in the external environment. Perhaps it was influenced by information, different bits of information from the physical environment. But it may entirely build something that is true, but exists within the creative sphere of the mind. And so that brings me back to considering, well, what exactly is this falsehood? And I began this strange side road by saying that often the Proverbs prompts us to consider absence. And true absence, or the desire for absence, I should say, is, I think, the primary principle of evil. that what they desire is the opposition to creation. They wish to destroy into nothingness, or to reduce to nothingness. Of course, it's a fool's errand, because nothingness is never really stable. Nothingness is itself like a talebearer. Nothing exists only in a broader context. Just like I can say that between myself and the microphone there is nothing. Of course there is something, but there's nothing in a particular sense, in the way in which I mean. And if I suddenly took that tale, if I endured the weight of it, if I became a talebearer in and of myself, and I adopted this expression, this narrative, what I would believe in is nothing. That everything that I did had no purpose and no meaning to it. It was completely pointless. And by that it would destroy the aspects of myself that believed in something. Which, of course, in order to survive, it believes in, the agent believes in itself, believes in its own identity, believes in something. So in this sense, the talebearer really means to endure that thing, because it is like a poison. It is a burden, that it is quite a heavy weight to carry. The words of a talebearer are as wounds. So, of this image that we are trying to paint and to create here, the words of this talebearer are just that base level ones and zeros transmission of information. The talebearer is descriptive in the sense that it gives us some understanding of how that information is organized, that there is a deceptive element likely within it. So of what I've said, I'm interested now to try and square this with what a wound actually is. We can start by describing various qualities of what this thing is, of what a wound is. A wound is something that is painful. It is something that is a breach in the surface of something. A wound in the skin, for example, is a breach in that outer protective layer of skin. So there's a type of transgression, I think we can say, or transnavigation of something that is quite forceful, that wishes to break a barrier. Thinking about a barrier in the Proverbs, the thing that is repeated over and over again is identity, and that identities are formed because they are identifiable. That there are principles that make them distinct from other things. This book that's in front of me, the Bible, has its own identity. There are things about this object that I can understand, interpret, that allows me to differentiate it from all the various physical objects that I see in front of me on my desk. And now this barrier, or the threshold, that is necessarily broken in the case of the wound, is in some sense, at least in my mind, moving from one space to another, one identity to another. And I can think about that in terms of my room. I can move from my room to the living room, and as I do that, I go through a threshold. The identity of the rooms have changed from a bedroom to a living room. And the reason that it is so, the reason that it is identifiable not only by me, but most people that live within the general area that share a similar culture as I, is because there are different things about that environment that cause us to suspect that that room, that space, is for one purpose and another room is for a different purpose. Now, of some purpose, we can say that It is the reason for which something is done or created, or for which something exists. Now, if we were to imagine the reason for something's existence, and it doesn't have to be one thing, it could be a number of things that are packaged together that form an identity. Like my room, for example. If I took everything out of this room and it was left basic, walls, floor, and that's it, most people would understand that it's still a room, but that goes back to the builder, and even taking a space relative to other spaces, regardless of the objects within it, is enough to form its identity. But regardless, let's say we have a structure, a building, that has completely uniform rooms, and that has yet to hook up any water or gas, or install a toilet to any of these rooms, so we really don't know that the rooms are symmetrical and they could be used for any purpose that we want. At this stage, we don't quite know the identity of the various things, but eventually we'll get to a certain threshold that now something has become something. There is a reason for its existence. Now, if I suddenly walk into this space, and let's say I'm an interior designer, and I fill this space with a bunch of different things. One room is a bedroom, another room is a common area, a lounge, another area is a kitchen, another area is a bathroom, and all these places have different identities. If I were to come into that space and knock over a wall, or break through a wall, let's say from two rooms that likely are not connected together, like a bedroom and a bathroom. Now, there can be a bathroom in a bedroom in a certain sense, but it's still separated by a door. If the wall was completely gotten rid of, then the space would change. There would be more of an invisible, perhaps, barrier that would then lead to the separation of the two. I remember when I was in graduate school, I lived in this loft in somebody's garage. And in that loft, there was a small room for the bedroom, which had a shower in it and a toilet, which had a door on it. And then the entire place was one room outside of that small bathroom. The front door was right next to the head of the bed. The refrigerator was at the foot of the bed. The kitchen table was to the right of the bed. And then, moving off of the foot of the bed, there was a living space, which there was like two couches. And then there was a kitchen area in which there was an oven, a microwave, a sink, all in one jam-packed area. And in that environment, eventually the identity of the individual spaces began to manifest. That if I wanted to do something for some purpose, I would go to a particular spot in the room. I wouldn't go to the same spot every time for the same expression, the same behaviors. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but what I'm getting at here is the wound is an insult to the identity of some structure. Now, eventually the wound, hopefully the wound will heal. It could be fatal in the sense that it dissolves the identity. Just thinking about the home type example, since I've been thinking about it. We can imagine a house that's demolished. Of course, that would completely get rid of the ability to identify where a bedroom is or a bathroom is. Or again, some major remodeling of the the spaces of the house. This is another way in which the identities can be reorganized or changed. And so I see it in this way. I see that the words of the talebearer are as wounds. They are as identity disruptors. So I'll mention that today is a new day. That happens to be in the morning before work. Usually I don't do the recordings before work, so I feel a little bit more energized than usual. I will return to my normal time in the evening of recording, but I wanted to get in some time now. So I believe last time I had left off, I finished the first part of that verse. The words of a talebearer are as wounds. The second part being, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. Again, this is something that we've seen before. This language is, I believe, verbatim from a prior verse, not in this chapter. But the belly is quite an interesting symbol. Again, if we had to give the belly characteristics, qualities, if we had to put ourselves in the mind of an ancient person, or of a person at the time that this book was translated, I have to wonder, perhaps we would think about things slightly differently, and perhaps we wouldn't. But regardless, I think most people have an innate understanding of what the belly is and how that the experience of having this belly provides us with some insights to the quality of this symbol. So we can approach this, I think, from a various number of ways. We can approach it physically, as we would examine a belly or a stomach. We can examine it in terms of the experience of our heart, that is, the feelings that are associated with the stomach, of the good and of the bad. And there are processes of mind, of course, it's well past that of digestion, that we consider the belly or the stomach to be a part of our experience. I think of the common expression, butterflies in one's stomach, and this is a general state of anxiety. Often it's associated with love, but I think it can also be associated with a nervousness or anxiety prior to giving a public presentation. Any number of things, I think, can elicit this situation. Of the physical, we can say that it is a place of digestion. It is a place that breaks down food into smaller components. It is a place of holding. It is a place of passage. In the broader sense, the belly is not restricted to the stomach, but more so to all of the abdominal contents. So out of all of these qualities, we have to find an inroad, a path that makes sense. The words of a talebearer are as wounds, and they go down into the innermost parts of the belly. Now, there are some easy aspects to this that we can sort of rule out that won't be quite productive. And that is, if a talebearer were suddenly to appear before me, or if I myself was a talebearer, because as I've mentioned, it is possible for somebody to be a talebearer and also suffer the similar consequences that one would suffer by receiving the tale. The talebearer, by his own will, I think, suffers similar consequences to that of the person that he may be trying to deceive. But nonetheless, if we think about the tale, I think we can rule out the possibility of this causing, or of this being, some physical representation. Now, it's possible that there may be some physical manifestation, some anxiety that's associated with not being able to discern that which is true, or losing one's identity in the extreme situation or circumstance. But rather, I think we should choose to see the belly in terms of mind, that it is a symbol that is from a physical representation. But its physical manifestation gives us formal qualities, formal ideas, perhaps, of which there are some that I had mentioned. There's a way in which the innermost parts of something is an indication or an expression of the size of the effect of some stimulus. That if, let's say, if I'm going to bring back this analogy of the room or of the house situation, of course there is a difference between the inside and the outside. And I think that in terms of most homes, even apartments, the innermost part of a living space is often where the intimate experiences of life occur. And I don't necessarily just relegate that to the romantic or the relational in terms of human relations, but rather intimate in the sense that our minds are set at ease. Sometimes they are set to inattentiveness. Sometimes it's required for that process of renewal, that re-energizing, rest. All of this occurs, of course, in the bedroom. Within our bedrooms, I think many of us have items that we keep close to us that we find profoundly meaningful. Of our homes, but more so in terms of our innermost parts of our homes or our living spaces, we find the bedroom to be a place that most people we would rather not invite into, because it is, in a sense, sacred, also private. Now, in the way that it is private, I mean that it is set apart from something. It belongs to the individual. It belongs to that singular identity. Of the sacred, we find that identity being somehow, in some way, through some practice, through some ritual, or in some space, or all of the above, being connected to the transcendent, being connected to that thing, the origin of intelligibility, the primary purpose through which all other purposes spring. And going back away from that, moving from the bridge between the individual and the transcendent, of course, at least what I've been calling as the soul, that transition place, that facilitator, the thing that allows us to be these interesting cognitive agents in an otherwise purely physical substrate. Again, seemingly But going back to the individual, going back to that identity, what I see connected to that bridge, but across that bridge, is various pillars, almost like Stonehenge. In this situation, each one of these pillars means something quite profound about who we are, what defines our being. Some of them hold memories, all of them related in some way to one another. I see that the tale comes in a rather violent manner to meet these constituent elements of our being. And as I've mentioned, the talebearer fractures identities. So when this tale comes in, the mechanism, however it may appear, that allows the mind to not only interface with the world, make accurate judgments based on the information that it receives, but also to make accurate inferences about itself, about its own thoughts, about its own core. All of this has the potential to be disrupted, to be transformed, to be influenced, and perhaps to be controlled. So it is the evening now of the same day. As I've mentioned, that earlier recording was in the morning before work. And now a full day of work is behind me. Perhaps one can tell that it's a bit quieter in the evening. Things have settled, a little bit more peaceful. So I'd like to get back into this verse. I think I'm approaching the end of it, but I think that there are always things that can be thought of, different paths to go down that can yield fruit. Now, considering this Stonehenge of pillars that make up our identity, much of this, as I think about myself, as I turn inward, turn my focus inward, it would take me a long time to come to understand something about these pillars that I suppose I can say are true, consistent, representative, holistic. The individual is quite complex. I can identify many qualities of myself, but I feel as though I will always come up short when I try to examine myself. And yet, despite my insecurities about such things, it is the case that myself, my identity, goes on. It continues. It is not a prerequisite to selfhood to understand it. It just is. And thinking about it in this way makes me realize how vulnerable these fundamental pieces of my identity are. For if something found itself way down in there, the question is, would I be prudent enough to identify it and to uproot it? And the answer is, some things surely I would be able to see, I'd be able to feel, sense it. Other things, more insidious, I probably would not be able to tell at all until it became a problem, until it's undeniable. Burning lips and a wicked heart are like a potsherd covered in silver dross. So there's a few things that we have to define that are not very common in the modern parlance. That is potsherd and silver dross. So from Old English we have two words that were combined into one. The word potsherd comes from pot and shard. Definition being a broken piece of ceramic material. Now similarly, the word dross has its origins in Old English, and it meant something like the scum or the refuse leftovers from smelting metals, used to describe impurities that floated to the surface when metals like iron or silver were melted. The term likely derives from the Old Norse, which referred to metallic waste, so it is something of little value. So again, burning lips and a wicked heart are like a potsherd covered with silver dross. So let's begin by thinking about the burning lips and a wicked heart. Beginning with burning lips, such a strange image. Of the lips, we have an obvious symbol of its physical structure. It is the gateway to the mouth. It is something that is finely tuned from a muscular point of view. There are many shapes and positions that we can manipulate the mouth into. And of course this is necessary to articulate our words in conjunction with our tongue. And although symbols like the mouth and like the tongue are often used and associated with meaning and of language, the lips, since they participate in the purpose of producing speech, I think also encompass that domain. And if we are to think about the formal sphere, if we are to think about the purposeful and meaningful sphere, what means the most is not necessarily the physical structure of the lips, or how it's innervated, or how the muscles are uniquely fashioned to provide us with such a sophisticated way of communicating. But rather it's the communication itself that we are concerned with at this moment. It is the transmission of value, much like in our hard physical currencies, we transmit value, monetary value. This value of mind as it finds itself in language is and has come to be indispensable to us. If, on a sudden, as we've discussed before in the previous few verses about the analogies to fire and its consuming habit with the substrate that it burns upon, having a fire burn on the lips would be quite devastating for the meaning of our words. For if our words serve to kindle the flame, eventually the flame will have its way and burn our words into nothing more than soot, to ash. There would be no more productive capacity offered. Burning also, in its act, is quite intense. It is quite expressive. And although I use in totality a temporary analogy, because again, the words only have so much substrate to handle that reaction, that sort of exothermic reaction of meaning, despite that, in the moment, the excited expression can yield many things, just like the excited expression of a burning object can yield many different things. It can serve many purposes. It could be an unfortunate circumstance. It can serve to burn down a building, burn down a house, somebody's belongings, perhaps take the life of a loved one. It can provide us with warmth. It can provide us with the necessary heat that is needed to cook our food so that we can consume it safely. Now, aside from all of this, from all of the potential roads that we can go down, most of them probably completely meaningless, the image that I think is useful and that I think that we should keep here is that the burning lips are lips that are very expressive, but also trending towards meaninglessness, trending towards that nothingness. Burning lips and a wicked heart. Now, to understand what a wicked heart is, we have to understand what a heart is. And I always find it great fun, especially at this point in the Proverbs, at chapter 26, after seeing the word heart so many times and being prompted to consider it so many times. I have this map and this image in my head. Who knows if it is consistent with others who have gone through the Proverbs, but I find it quite useful. There are a few different things, a few different images that come to mind when I think about the heart. First and foremost, I think of the heart as an aspect of mind. The heart certainly brings up images of the physical structure of the heart. But much like the belly, I think that the heart has this representation because there seems to be this visceral sense in which the body provides us with such intense feelings from particular areas that it is not until we experience something quite profound that it then provokes this more peripheral sensory stimulation. So the heart is an aspect of mind. It is this output for which it represents the seat of our feelings and our desires. So today is a new day. My apologies for the break in the previous thought, but I'll resume rather shortly here. The heart is such a fascinating topic, fascinating symbol, something so fundamental to our experience. Given that we are talking about a way of finding the truth that includes the self, that includes the subject in that experience, the heart serves as a vital component to that entire enterprise. Again, the seat of our feelings and our desires. I've described the heart through various verses as something that retains a degree of its own agency. The agency is, of course, partial in the sense that it is only a component of the broader self, or a component of the broader agent. It serves as a component of the broader will. Another component of that would be our logical side, our reasoning. And much like the examples that I've used earlier about the pillars of identity and how they're all related to one another, the heart and reason are intimately linked. So I think it might be worthwhile discussing why that's the case. or why I believe it to be the case. I've spent some time thinking over the potential situations or scenarios in which a feeling can exist independent of some thought, or at least in my mind. When I say a thought, I mean some linguistic representation of value. That when I think about things, there is a voice that proposes things, much like I'm speaking into this microphone. I have this voice inside of my head, that inner monologue, or perhaps dialogue, between one party and another. The two interlocutors are engaged in this sort of platonic discussion to try and find out what the best course of action might be, what the truth of something might be, whatever. But in this process, I could say perhaps that in my mind this exists a little bit downstream of where I would say that the heart, or just the generative reasoning element, is. The expression of these two things, I think, takes the form of this dialogue, the Platonic dialogue. But at the fundamental level, the heart is something that is a producer. It is a producer of base emotions. It is something that includes my perceptive capacity from the sensors in my body. It is something that is responsive to the various neurotransmitters that give us the perception of feeling, of anxiety, of happiness, of sorrow, of joy. All of these experiences and feelings, it can be quite an intricate procedure to dissect a feeling from its reasonable component, to get to the root of that thing. Because in order to describe it, we have to give some reason to it. But insofar as we describe it, our reason attempts to strip away the reasonable component, which I think is kind of interesting. Now, I've spent some episodes on this. Where they are, I'm not sure, but I know that I have spoken at length on this. And there are, in fact, Proverbs that I think go into this in detail. They prompt us to consider that fine relationship. And I think this is one of them, because we have to talk about what it means to have a wicked heart. For something to be wicked, it implies a degree of agency. So we have to get ourselves to the point where we understand what this agency is. So to progress here, this reason versus this emotion, or these feelings. Another image that I have used to describe the heart is that of a factory, sort of an industrial analogy to that of the experience of the heart. That the factory is not a mindless entity. It exists to satisfy the market. It depends on the forces of the market to produce. But it has a centralizing authority structure to it, in the sense that there is a foreman, maybe we could say, or a director of operations, of production. And this director is, in my mind, a bit mysterious, cloaked, at times at least. When I feel a strong desire towards something, a strong desire that is either provoked by my reason or so sudden and so immediate that I don't necessarily have time to understand exactly or to attribute thoughts, to attribute reason to such an experience. I think of the experience of being frightened or startled in this way. There are many others that we can examine, but this one fits quite well. It is often the case that when we are startled or frightened about something, it doesn't have to be somebody scaring us. It could be more subtle, like walking alone at night and having just a general sense of something being off. And we may not understand exactly why we have this feeling. We may attribute some reason to it, but given a particular incident, a particular situation, like a sound or even a person that jumps out that we didn't expect, what we respond to physically is often much faster than we can give our reason to. And that if we hear a loud sound behind us, of course we don't know what it is, but the sound is enough to excite the heart and to fill us with adrenaline, to raise the heart rate, to get us to turn around and to examine exactly what that sound was. In that way, I've described the heart as having some degree of will and of agency. Now, this is just the first stop of discussing the heart and of its agency. Beneath this layer, at a more deeper personal layer, the heart, I think, has the ability to possess wisdom. Wisdom, this word that is often difficult to define. We could take hours on it just in and of itself, examining it and figuring out how it applies to our own experience. But generally speaking, my definitions of wisdom always come down to including the idea of connectedness, of understanding the interrelatedness of parts, of accurately understanding identity, of making accurate judgments based on the information that is provided one. And a person that is strong in feeling, I think, does more than just respond to things that are exciting in the environment. I suppose we can define exactly what one means by exciting, because we can extend that word excitement to all sorts of different things, but excitement in the sense of something that is uncertain, like the noise that had startled us, for example. This is quite superficial. I think there's another layer that I have experienced involving the heart that has to do more with human interaction. It has to do with my place, my belonging, in some sense my being. I think we can say that one can be at peace, one can be at rest, be at liberty, be at confusion, be at anger. There's a lot of different ways in which one can be, which the heart has a pivotal role in facilitating. Now, there's a few errors, perhaps, in some of the analogies that I had used, but just speaking loosely, I think that this is the case. Now, I'd like to relay another example about how the heart is that industrial machine that is always running in the background, just like our industry in this country is always running in the background to keep life moving along, to satisfy our desires, to meet the needs of individuals, but also collective groups like corporations or of states. I think sometimes, given the interrelatedness of the mind and of one's own experience, it's difficult to appreciate how the bare bones, the production of the raw materials, really are the bedrock, the foundation of our emotional prosperity. Just like in the former example that I had used, the industry of the economy is the bedrock of our material prosperity. And of all of the various things that we use basic elements for, I think about the power that the heart has when paired or wed to reason. Because in reason, we have the integration of these, the connection, the synthesis, perhaps the motivation, propagation, production of various behaviors, of complex relationships between peoples. But this business about a heart of being, having a wicked heart, as this verse says, it really provokes me into a certain mood, a certain mindset. The word wicked is something that we have seen over and over and over again in the Proverbs. It is a term that I've often put right in the middle between the fool and the evil person, sharing in certain qualities but differing to some degree. The wicked person I've generally conceptualized as somebody that is autoaxial or selfish. That thing around primarily around where their attention revolves is themselves. And in fact, and usually when I use the term wicked to describe a person, it is of the person, of the whole person. As I mentioned before, I'm considering the heart and reason and other components to be just that, components of one's identity. The wicked person on the whole, I think, is a bit different than saying that a person has a wicked heart. It might lead to a wicked person on the whole, but there's a little bit more subtlety, I think, that we have to explore here when we say a wicked heart versus a wicked person. So going back to this industrial factory, again, the mechanism by which our everyday experiences are afforded. If one is to toss wickedness into this experience, what would we find? How would it change the production of our feelings? Now, to go back to what I was saying just a moment ago, the wicked person, being autoaxial, is interested in their own desires. But of course, this brings in other components. That interest, that willful interest, it exists on the part of the heart, but also on the part of reason. And so the object now is to separate reason from that polluted heart, from that wicked heart, and how to do such a thing. So if we go to the basics, if we lay out before us the formal domain, let's say maybe the mental domain, as a blank slate, I'm thinking about looking out into what appears to be empty space. This overwhelming void of seemingly emptiness, nothingness. but of course it is not nothing. The mind permeates this space with light, with meaning. It makes sense of that nothingness. And as I imagine this pillar, this component of our identity or of our selfhood, that is the heart, and I release that beacon into this space, what I find is this agent that is constantly hungry, constantly mining the nothingness and producing something. Constantly making sense to things that exist, which then of course would negate my previous expression there. It would be like saying that mining something physically in the earth and bringing up certain contents would be bringing up something from nothing, which of course is not true. So perhaps the illustrative landscape is a bit off. Maybe what we should see before us is potential, however that may look. And that the mind brings light, but also the capacity to elevate the potential into something that is meaningful. Bring it into that experience, bring it into the agentic arena for which it now operates within a network, a meaningful network, a sense-making network. And so I see this process occurring in the material domain as well as the mental. But of course now we're considering the mental domain because we're talking about wickedness in the heart. So to speak a little bit more about wickedness, the etymology of the word I think is quite interesting. From Old English we have the word appearing as Wicca, male witch, or Wiccy maybe, female witch, which is related to sorcery or to magic. The term comes from the verb Wiccan, which means the practice of witchcraft. From Proto-Germanic. Farther back we have a word that means necromancer. Again, somebody who practices witchcraft. In Middle English, a bit later, we have a word similar to what we know now of wicked, W-I-K-K-E-D, and its meaning expands beyond that of witchcraft to general moral badness, evil, or sinful behavior. But I don't think that this is a correct characterization. I don't think it is an extension beyond witchcraft at all. It is an extension beyond witchcraft in the sense that a mind may interpret witchcraft as something that is in a place or of a mechanism that is different, perhaps, than we understand mechanisms today. However, this witchcraft, I think, does still carry a degree of mystery to it. If we trace this a little bit through that etymological landscape, we consider the term witchcraft, two words that are put together. Of course, that Wicca, this is something that we have spoken of. And then the craft, which is a skill or art. It is something that is practiced. It is something that, from Proto-Indo-European, means to carve or to make. So exactly what is it that we are carving or making or practicing? Of course, we are doing magic. We are practicing magic. But what does magic mean outside of the more superficial definitions and nonsensical definitions. The term magic comes from the Latin word magia, which itself is derived from Greek, which I don't know how to pronounce this. That Greek word that I had mentioned refers to the art of practicing, or of the practice of the Magi, the Zoroastrian priests of ancient Persia. And they were known for their study, their knowledge of astrology, divination, other forms of mystical or religious wisdom. The original Greek word that I had mentioned originally was neutral, or even positive, referring to the sacred and esoteric knowledge that the Magi had possessed. The Magi of today, of course, who are secular, but practice in the domain of mathematics. We have our physical theorists, and that knowledge, that esoteric knowledge that is only possessed by a few, I think remains consistent. If we look back at the Old Persian and Indo-European roots of this word magic, we find the meaning of priest, or one that is skilled in spiritual arts. We have words that mean, or a word that means, to be able, or to have power, related to words like might and machine. In Latin and in medieval usages, we have the spiritual or mystical connotations, the practices of the priests. Eventually it began to take on more negative connotations, referring to sorcery or enchantment, supernatural forces, contrasting religion. In the Middle Ages, magic was used to describe a sense of natural magic associated with things that are just beyond understanding, hidden forces, and black magic associated with malevolent or supernatural powers. And it wasn't until the Renaissance and into modern English that the word magic came to describe any practice or event that appeared to influence reality through supernatural means, whether it be for entertainment, deception, or religious purposes. So I think what we need to do here is to save this word a little bit from the Renaissance period, to take it in its neutral sense, in its neutral meaning. We can keep supernatural, perhaps. Perhaps we can keep that which is beyond our understanding. But once we understand it, even if we understand quite well the mystical layering of our reality, what was once called supernatural would readily become natural. But in the older sense, in that neutral sense, this word magic, the practicing of the spiritual arts, which of course is what we are doing now to a certain degree. We're not making sacrifices. But I suppose that could be debated. There are things that are being sacrificed in order to participate in this experience. There is a certain art and a certain craft to coming to understand something through one's own experiences, through deliberate self-reflection, through the passing down of the word, through experience, through observation, in a literary form or verbal form. religion, spiritual matters, often serve to connect us. That religio is the sense of bondedness that we feel, that we experience. And despite the shift in the connotation of magic towards something that is more negative than it is neutral or even positive, much like the word pride, I think we can examine it in the sense that it is destructive to the self, destructive to others, but also in the sense that it is positive. That to be satisfied in something is not necessarily bad in and of itself. We can be satisfied in ourselves or in others to a degree that is not counterproductive, that is not self-aggrandizing. Another thing that could be said about magic, I think, is that it is a tool, a process, by which one practices finding truth, but finding truth through the spiritual domain. Now, for some reason, the contemporary mind finds itself in conflict with this sort of thing. But of course, spiritual affairs are a precedent to material affairs. At least in our sense of things, we must find ourselves a part of this show, a part of this play. And once we reduce ourselves to absence, to nothingness, to see ourselves something that does not participate in this experience, but rather just sort of looks on it, then I think we miss the very procedure by which we come to propel ourselves, to motivate ourselves, to understand the substrate that we find ourselves in. Now, I suppose we can be separated from it for a little while, like a fish out of water, but eventually we will have to return. And I would go as far as to say that science, as we know it to be today, is a form of magic, at least in the terms that I have been using to describe it, my preferential terms. So returning to the word wicked, we have found ourselves in a split road that might cause us to define the term wicked as something other than it has come to be. And so we have to avoid this pitfall, but also retain the aspect of this magic that is neutral or positive, because I don't think the mind will be able to understand wicked truly if it doesn't understand what magic is. And if magic is only restricted to something that is a hollow vessel, that is something from a bygone age, that is no longer practical in the modern day, or that doesn't agree with our modern conceptualizations of the world, of reality, if that's all we use, of course we won't understand magic. And by extension, the word wicked, I think, will become more difficult to understand. Now, I should mention that today is a new day, and it will take me some time to get back up to speed. Burning lips and a wicked heart are like a potsherd covered with silver dross. So we were at the point of describing wicked, following that rabbit trail, finding the term magic, establishing that it refers to, at least in the meaningful sense, a practice or a way in which somebody comes to understand knowledge or truth. Now, this knowledge and truth is restricted to certain domains, obviously, the religious domain, that spiritual domain. There's a degree of mysticism to it. But fundamentally, it involves the individual experience as it is passed down over time. Of the religious component, we can say the same, but we must add, of course, the aspect of religion that we all find useful, that binding component, the religio component. The whole reason that we devote attention to it is because human affairs are not straightforward. They are not simple. They are often complicated problems. Our own experiences, our own lives are often complicated problems. And it takes time, it takes attention, it takes dedication, it takes discipline in order to order things such that life is manageable and productive. Now, I can imagine that this term magic has come from a long tradition of different practices. Now, over time, the term obviously evolved in its meaning, took on certain things, abandoned others, and certainly, much like our scientific beliefs today, there are things about them, the way in which we approach problems, that are incorrect. But the fundamental underlying desire is to find that which is true. Now, we must order things, I think, a little bit more clearly before we explicitly connect wicked and the heart. Now, I do not wish to say that I want to abandon all meaning of the word wicked and the word magic. But we do have to leave those elements of understood definition and take those that are fit for our purposes here. And it's not necessarily that we take them so that we can make our purposes correct, but rather we take them so that we can make sense of them. And I suppose that there's a degree of correctness involved in making sense of something. But if I were to put it differently, if we were to take this verse and use the terms in a completely modern context, which probably has changed quite a bit over the past 100, 200 years, I think we would find something that is wholly lacking. A verse that just didn't fulfill the spiritual need, the spiritual desire. So again, of this term wicked, it could be said that a wicked person is one that practices the art of witchcraft, which is the practice of magic. Now, in this situation, I think it is particularly useful to use the modern connotation, and I'm sure that the word wicked has retained the notion that that which is wicked is negative, like the situation in terms of conceit, where it's an excessive pride, where pride in and of itself may not necessarily be negative, but the added word conceit and the excess of pride implies that it is wrong, it is wicked. However, the term wicked, it cannot be just restricted to a base term like pride, in which there is a potential for negativity. Wicked in the Proverbs is used as something that is explicitly negative. There's no way around it. And so we have to add something to our formal definition that we have been exploring. Now, of course, my interpretation of this has always included an aspect of this term that is profoundly destructive. But more in terms of matters related to the definition that I have looked up online, we have to amend this a little bit. Amend it in a way that would connect wickedness and the negative aspects of the art of practicing magic. Now, one must ask the question, in order to pair wickedness with the heart, how is it possible to negatively practice the effects, or the arts of witchcraft and magic? Well, in my mind, I must examine a contemporary example. Otherwise, it would be difficult to make sense of it. I think of the modern-day medical establishment and all the various institutions that surround it, support it. And I think of the psychiatric umbrella. And of this psychiatric umbrella, we have various working professionals. They practice their craft. Their craft, of course, is based in terms of scientific, what we would call objective observations, of analysis and interpretation of the data as such. Many psychiatrists, psychologists are involved with the spiritual domain. They recognize it as an important part of man's experience, and so perhaps they dabble in that too. But regardless of their particular bent, regardless of their way that they climb the mountain towards that divine peak, towards the truth, it can be said that of those that practice within the mental domain, or that are primarily concerned about affairs of a conscious being, that it is possible to enter into a space with somebody such that they would have a profound influence, that they would weave their way perhaps even into the pillars of their own identity and fix themselves in nefarious ways such that they reorder those principles, cripple those principles, submit them to the authority of the parasitic behavior on the part of the professional. And of course we can expand this out, but this is where my mind goes first and foremost. It is because these people are practiced in this sort of thing. Even without formal study, they, in their clinical practices, go through these experiences day in and day out, and that repetition really solidifies a good understanding, a good potential for which these working professionals can find a doorway into the, maybe not necessarily the soul, but certainly the heart, the mind in general, of the individual that they are trying to help, or perhaps not. Now, as I mentioned, there are various other ways that this can result. I think of a parent and a child, how sacred that relationship is because of the developing mind of the child. I think of also a pair bond between two closely related people, whatever that relationship may look like. It could be a marriage, it could be a sibling relationship, who knows. But any relationship really has the potential for some nefarious actor to wiggle their way into the deep confines of somebody else's mind and begin to practice this art. Now, the art here refers to magic, but it's not holy magic. Now, holy in the sense of the entirety, not holy in terms of heavenly. Now, what I mean by that is, it is possible for a person to practice divination or spiritual growth, however that might look. There are plenty of different spiritual practices. There are plenty of ways in which a person can engage to enliven that part of themselves that makes them understand but also feel connected to the things that are around them, to the institutions, to the people around them. It gives them a broader perspective of their place in the world, not least of which is scientific, which I think can be classified under a form of magic. Now, I say can be because somehow some people get away with it without really involving spiritual affairs, and perhaps that's wrong at some level. I'm sure everybody does. Everybody has a direction that they are going. Nobody is completely, at least in the modern age, in terms of our professorship, it would seem that most people are quite independent and individual, less likely to be completely slave-like in their intellectual endeavors. But who knows? So speaking of this magic, again, regardless of the situation, we can examine any number of scenarios in which a person that is skilled in the spiritual arts may, by some way of inference or of intuition or of learned experience of their own life or of a multitude of other lives, may seek to predict or to add on to a pattern that at once was seen or imagined, and to use this pattern to wrap it around the most sensitive aspects of a person and to use it for their own desires. And this type of conceited expression of the religious pursuits, I find this profoundly negative. And it is within this type of behavior that we find the wicked person. I think they just as easily do this to others as they do to themselves, except when they do it to themselves, they're so blinded by their own selfishness, again, their own conceit, that they don't understand where they have misstepped. Burning lips and a wicked heart. So now let's say we combine this wickedness to the heart. What do we see? What image unfolds in front of us? Well, if the heart is to be this structure, this mental structure that affords us with our feelings and our desires, if it is something that has a degree of its own will, autonomous to a degree, but also intimately related to the other pillars of who and what we are, to our reason, to our memories perhaps, and to the somatic inputs, the rest of the body. Perhaps we can add that as another pillar. We can classify things in various ways. Perhaps there are some that are more correct than others, but at least the two, the heart and our rational mind, have sufficed for me for quite some time. But now we have a matter of attributing wickedness to the very being, to the very bedrock of one of these pillars of existence, of being again. So I think that there's two major consequences that we see here. We have the consequences of the fundament being polluted by wickedness, and then we have the consequences of how this manifests in the world, which I think we've spoken of some. I've certainly spoken of it before, if not on this episode. But of the first, that of the pollution of the fundament, this is an internal experience. This is how the individual is impacted by their own behavior or by their own belief. And if the heart is to be fundamentally wicked, we have to imagine that it is not just the behavior of the person or of that will, but rather the very structure of the thing that is in place that is permeated with this disease of wickedness. So if it is to be completely rotted to its core, what we are saying is that the very thing that gives rise to our emotions, our desires, the very thing that synthesizes vast amounts of information and allows us to intuit things about our environment that reason alone would have such a difficult time in doing, partly because of all the variables, partly because of how long it would take. That to pollute such a mapping structure by wickedness, again a subversion of the truth towards ends that are fundamentally self-exalting. But again, we have to be careful here, because what I'm suggesting is that the heart itself is wicked. It is not the individual that is consciously saying, I'm going to be wicked today. It is a base level of experience. Now, this is not to say that the person is damned because of it. Salvation does exist. The salvation would come at quite a cost, though. To rebuild such a thing would be very painful to the individual, to go through such a death and rebirth. Although amazing and miraculous, it would be extremely painful. And I suppose that there would have to be a strong willful component to accept that there's something fundamentally wrong that needs to be changed, even though if one doesn't understand what it is, it's possible for that change to occur. So if we cannot say, then, that this wickedness is some self-imposed experience, how then does the creation of our feelings and desires look? And I think we must also say that this wickedness then comes from without. It's an evil source. It's an infiltration from beyond. We could say that it's supernatural, but of the minded sphere, it is something almost like intuition of itself. It is beyond our reason. It comes to us for we do not know why. We can examine it all we want, and perhaps we will find some physical cause, perhaps not. It doesn't really matter from my perspective. So I'm thinking in my mind of this factory that I have associated with the heart that is producing all of these products. Except the wicked factory is the factory that makes partial products, substandard products. They are sort of like the nationalist, the strong nationalist in the sense of the tyrannical nationalist, the utopian nationalist that wishes to bring about a type of being, a type of society that is perfect and without blemish, without sin. Now, of course, the heart itself desires this. It satisfies its own desire for existence and experience by its own existence. But its existence not for something else, not for that which is outside of it, or independent of it, but for it alone. And as I've reasoned to before, an identity cannot exist by itself independent of anything else. It can be something that is classified independently, have an identity of its own, but it always depends on on something else for it to continue to maintain itself. And so this wicked heart, it produces all of these feelings and these desires. And what it is after is truth, but it is a distorted version of it. That distorted version would wish to see, wish to believe, that the self that the heart is a part of is the supreme deity. And that all purposes, all behaviors, all actions are subordinate to the desires of that deity, which is, of course, the self. Burning lips and a wicked heart are like a potsherd covered with silver dross. Now, a potsherd, as I believe I've mentioned a little while ago, is a broken piece of ceramic material. And silver dross is an impurity. An impurity that is involved in the processing of metals. And so what we have here is, at once there was some original structure. There was an identity of the pot that was fully formed. And we have to imagine that this pot had these impurities steeped within it. And of the impurities that are steeped within it, I go back to my analogy of the fundament being polluted by this contrary magic and the exalting of the self, that either one or all of these, one in this situation, the heart, one of the pillars of our being is polluted by this madness. And again, that wickedness and the magic, in the contrary sense, is the impurity. That silver dross is already within the pot. Now we fracture the identity of the pot, and we take just a shard from it, and the shard with the silver dross. This is a fractured identity with material that is not valued at all. There's poor value to it. So again, burning lips and a wicked heart are like a potsherd covered with silver dross. And so if we have to compare this analogy, a potsherd with silver dross, I wonder what more could be said. It would seem that the identity of such a person, that of a wicked heart, now we have to remember here that just because a component of that identity is lost and that it draws the self into itself. Doesn't necessarily mean it's gone. But there's an interesting prompting here to consider what it really means for this identity to come under this spell, such that if we imagine a pot and it being fractured, that it is no longer its identity, but rather something broken and partial, but even more than just broken and partial, but polluted and meant to be discarded. And going back to that first image of the burning lips, and of thinking about the prior verses discussing the wood as it burns away, and of the object of the principle that was left beneath it, we have nothing. It is dispersed out into the environment, no longer held by us. So we have at once this dispersion away from us, that grasping of valuable information, perhaps even the orientation of our attention. And then we have the fracturing of our being. The fracturing of our being, and then that self, to add insult to injury, the further self-reflection of the fractured bits being polluted and valueless. Perhaps because of it being polluted and valueless, led to the fracture in the first place. An interesting verse, I think, to take with us throughout our days. Something to come back to and to reflect on. He that hates disassembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. So here we have 2 verses, verse 24 and 25, that are connected by a semicolon. So we have to consider them at once separate, because they're separate by verse, but also continuous in the sense that they are separated by a semicolon. So begin with the first half of the first verse. He that hates disassembles with his lips. So today happens to be a new day. Now, what I would like to do is to begin with talking about the word hate. Every once in a while we see this word come up in the Proverbs, but it is not as a consistent theme as some other words. So I'd like to spend some time on it. The first thing that I'd like to comment on is the relationship that this word hatred has to our heart. Hatred, of course, being a term that is filled with meaning, like all words, obviously, but thinking about it in this way, thinking about hatred, the word, as a package that comes to us, that perhaps at once we may not necessarily know how to explicitly define it, but somehow we feel as though we know it. It is part of our experience. Perhaps we have felt it, or we have felt something that is approaching it. There's a certain sense of intensity that accompanies this word. Also, from my perspective, hatred heavily involves the action of the heart. Now, whether or not hatred can be said to be truly an emotion, or a base emotion that is independent of reason or any thought. It's hard to say. But at the very least, on this journey to understand the word, I find intensity of feeling, being high up on that list. Now, of course, intensity of feeling doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has hatred for somebody else, or that there is this burning hate within. There are plenty of feelings that can have a high degree of intensity. But this word, hate, of similar words we have loathe, detest, despise, strongly dislike. Of loathing, we have an intense feeling of dislike, or of disgust. Of disgust, we have a feeling of revulsion, or strong disapproval, aroused by something unpleasant or offensive. It seems as though in many cases we are drawn away from that which is good, or that which we have this innate sense. And perhaps I shouldn't reduce it to just that which is innate, because I think there are plenty of things that modify our senses and our perceptions of things, especially our broad understanding of that which is good. But regardless of this, when something does happen that comes across our minds or permeates our senses, there are things that are readily detestable, that many people find detestable. It could be something as simple as a foul odor, like a rotting corpse of an animal, perhaps. Or it could be of an idea, or a behavior of some individual that we find equally as repulsive, stimulating in different ways, of course. Now, the degree to which we find it repulsive is in some sense the degree that determines our response to it. Our intense aversion to something causes us more likely to be within that domain of hate. There is this desire, this pull to move away from that thing that can be either known or unknown to us. Unknown in the sense that we are able to perceive of something, even if we don't understand the full consequences of our perception of it. Known in the sense that we feel as though we have achieved an adequate understanding to pass adequate judgment. And considering the heart, and considering the analogy that I have gone to over and over, that industrial factory that produces base emotion, that satisfies the economy of mind, gives it this colorful experience that is common among human beings. That much like an economy of a nation, in times of strife, in times of difficulty, in times of profound, rapid, and unseen change the behavior, the character of the collective mind and of its expression of value, its economy, both in the material but also in the minded, because of course they are connected. I think we can draw a similar parallel that in such difficult, or again intense, situations, it is necessary to direct rapidly the motion of broad portions of a civilization towards one central end, perhaps to protect it, perhaps to satisfy a curiosity. But in such situations, the mobilization of material and personnel is on a scale that is often unfathomable in states that are otherwise peaceful or not as turbulent. And I feel like hate is one of those experiences of the industrial machine that contributes to the economy of mind. The pressure that our heart, this factory, finds itself under is immense. It's dictatorial to a degree, and tyrannical in its execution, but necessary for the survival of the identity. Or perhaps the survival of something. It could be an institution. Of course, this is not in the minded sense, but in the minded sense it could be a thought, a firmly held belief that has its roots wound into the pillars of our own identity. I think these sorts of things, accompanied by the lack of sacrifice, allows one to become blinded by our own ignorance, by our own understandings, beliefs of what is true. And I think hate can find itself bred in such a turbulent environment. I think of the end of the Ottoman Empire, when the story that unfolds is that of continual liberalization of not only markets but of state apparatuses, and of the way in which people are governed, the way in which people view themselves. And this rapid change of identity, and of all of the history in mind, and the attempts to grab onto and to hold the reins of power. An old, failing empire reaches out for a scapegoat to draw attention away from its failing inner core, its disillusioned peace. Such things certainly led to hate, led to genocide. The intense feelings of dislike, dehumanization. When I was a kid, I used to play a lot with Legos. I used to build all sorts of things, both in terms of a set that is provided with an outline that you follow the instructions to build the objects that are on the box, or just of a more creative pursuit of taking random pieces and creating something out of nothing. For whatever reason, I think of this in my youth, and I think of disassembling the pieces after I had built something. And how much this relates to the conversation of identity. Let's say, for example, I have this structure that I have built. It has some form, has plenty of different qualities to it. It fulfills some purpose in this broader narrative that I'm playing out in my mind. I can remove one brick at a time until eventually I am unable to use that structure for the purpose that I want. The structure no longer represents what it once had represented. And like so many verses before in this chapter, in this book, we are prompted back here to consider that removing enough will destroy the thing that one is taking from. And now we are being asked to consider this emotion of the heart, the intensity of such a negative emotion, wherever it may come from, whatever cause in the chain that leads the heart to produce it. Its output is as destructive as the chain of events that had caused it to be, I think, in the first place. Even if the last link that was responsible for the production of hate in our hearts was our own inability to set aside our ego, the way in which we think of things. But again, it is destructive in the way that it threatens something quite deeply about us. Possibly. Of course, the lips, again, we are referring to a symbol that represents speech, it represents language, it represents the transmission of meaning through words. Identity itself lies within the domain of what we might call the formal domain or the conscious sphere. That things are identified by agents, they're manipulated by agents. And that what he is disassembling by this output, this hate, this intense desire that calls him away from the thing of focus, the thing of attention. It either draws him away from it such that he moves himself away from it in the minded sense, or the physical sense, or he destroys the thing. He destroys the identity through his words, however twisted he may find them to be, to execute that purpose. He that hates disassembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. So we've come around again to another new day. It'll take me a little bit to get up to speed here. But the second half of this verse, laying up deceit within him, we've seen this pattern before. The first half seems to be expressionary. He that hates disassembles with his lips. The symbol of the lips, this seems like an outgoing transaction of information. But when we consider the second half, laying up this deceit internally is because of this expression, as if there is some strong relationship between one's behavior and one's inner workings. Now, I suppose that there are many verses that we can point to in the previous verses and previous chapters of similar patterns. But like most situations, I think it's most appropriate to build a new representation of this pattern, to further solidify it within our minds. And so I'll try not to repeat too much of what I had said about the first verse, though some retracing of that territory will probably be necessary. If we imagine this inner domain, or at least for a moment we should imagine that there is this inner domain that is completely separate from the outer domain. Inner in the sense that of the mind that is exposed to the environment, it retains its sense of identity. It may be exposed to judgment from without. Something from without may be able to understand its identity from within. And so there may be this permeation, this transpermeation of mind. And because of this potential possibility, for which perhaps in man's stronger relations he may find this, as he understands another person well. But I also think of other agents, of larger agents, or of agents that are on a different plane or level of experience, that they synthesize information differently, perhaps more efficiently, more effectively. They see patterns quicker, broader. And much like we can identify in an animal similar traits, patterns of behavior, I imagine a situation in which a higher being recognizes, interprets the behavior of man in a similar manner. Why is this important? Well, there's a voice in my mind that is saying, be careful about the language that you use. Be careful about using the language of inner and outer to describe yourself and your relationship to the environment. Because there is uncertainty how accurate this description, this representation actually is. So taking this as it is and understanding it, imagining now the self, imagining the principal identity of concern. We could think of ourselves in this particular example, or of another individual that we know quite well. We are going to need to understand this environment fairly well. in order to understand what it means to lay up deceit within it. Now, before we progress too far into this imagistic landscape, what I'd like to talk about for a moment is the word lay up. And lay up deceit within him. A strange word if one is to commit any thought to it. For to lay something, to place something somewhere, is easy enough to understand. But there's a significance to where we lay something. Now, usually when we go to sleep, we say that we lay down. If we wish to go to rest, we lay down. But if we were to say the opposite, that of a state of excitement, I suppose we wouldn't use the word lay for such a thing. But we would use the word up. So of this confusing term, I say we should go back to this landscape of the inner parts of the mind and all of its haziness. And of this word lay, I also think of a synonym, the word to put. Now, if I take this pen and I lay it down, what can we say happens here? Not in a physical sense, but more in a purposeful, directed sense. And let's also pretend that in this situation, I'm doing it for purposes other than just self-demonstration. That in some scenario, I had just finished using this pen. To put it down, I would say is in some sense to relinquish something. A certain expression into the atmosphere of meaning that I am done with the identity, the purpose, the utility, the functional component of this object. That my attention no longer desires it. It no longer needs it to execute its purposes. Now there's a significance here in terms of the word down. To lay it or to put it, I can place it in many different areas. In a sense, I can place it in many different physical locations. But this is not the domain that we are choosing to play in at the moment. In the minded sense, when I put this down, it is as I described. I'm done with it. I no longer have any reason to use it. And in that sense, it is laid away. Its purpose is put to rest for now, until the agent requires it again. Now this reflection is quite unfinished. I think there's another image that I like to bring in here. It's more of a common understanding of the word of being laid up. It implies illness. It implies that there is this state of being that necessitates rest, that necessitates retirement. Now, in a way, putting this pen away is similar in the sense that it is being retired, but not in the sense that it is burdened by some illness. that by my putting it down, that as a tool, this pen is somehow degraded. There's another way in which we can think of the term lay up as being put away, like a prisoner is held behind bars in captivity. We can say this of varying degrees of relationality. We can, more in a comedic sense. My friend, for example, his wife may lay him up, which is not a sexual reference. What I mean by that is she does not allow him to go out or to hang out with friends. So of these expressions, of the images that are now put forth, in bringing back this pen into our focus, I would like to say that when I put this down, I am indeed retiring it. I am indeed finished with the purpose of the object. I no longer desire what it would assist me in solving. There are no problems that present that would necessitate the use of this pen. And so in that sense, to put it down is not necessarily to retire its identity completely. It still remains a pen. It's still there for the future. But in the immediate sense, the use is done and over. If, on the other hand, I said, I laid up this pen, I think the opposite, to a degree. I'm still putting this somewhere. I'm putting this up in the sense that I take the pen with me because I know that, for example, when I start my day, I must have a pen with me because I will use it. In that way, I would say that I lay up a pen in my pocket. A rather strange expression, though. We may not necessarily be comfortable or be used to that type of usage, but I think it makes sense. And now, since this pen is laid up in my pocket, it is ready to be used. It is put there for a purpose. That sense of up is to indicate or to imply readiness. I think there's a broader understanding that we can come to in terms of the minded vertical, that of what we would consider to be up and that which we would consider to be down. We could think of things in terms of value, that when we say something is lower or down or something that is higher or up, we could say that in the first instance the value is low, and the second the value is high. But certainly I think it could be said that the value of the pen decreases as my need for it decreases, and conversely, the value of the pen increases as my need for it increases. I think we see this reflected commonly in the market, in the economy. If something is in need, the price for that object will go up, or rather, I should say, the demand for that object will go up. So I think another interesting element of this verse, the implication, is that there is a call to the future. That the pen is laid up in my pocket because I will, sooner rather than later, certainly within the day, within reason, I will take it up, and I will use what it is designed for, to solve some problem that I have, like writing down my thoughts so I don't forget them, for example. So now we return to that landscape of mind, whether it be our own or somebody that we know quite well. And instead of a pen, we speak of deceit. Deceit in this situation is the tool. It is that primary focus. It is the thing that is going to be used and lays up deceit within him. He that hates disassembles with his lips. So it is by his action. Instead of the hand putting the pen down, it is the mind that is manipulating the mouth to speak. And instead of the tool, the pen, being the thing that we utilize as an extension of our thoughts into the physical world, we remain in the mental domain, at least in the second instance. And then I would have to wonder about the mechanism that leads the mind to hate, that leads the heart to produce this foul, intense emotion. This loathing, opposition, dislike, disinclination, hostility. Generally speaking, the desire to move away from, to run from, to wish to never attend to it again, to see something as satisfying no useful purpose, now or any time in the future, to put down completely and forever. Such a thing is difficult to imagine justification for, especially in terms of a human being. It may be said to exist, this hate, but ultimately there seems to be something that is given, something that is abandoned by the mind, while although justified to a degree in certain opinions or thoughts about the negativity or the judgment of a particular person, the level, that hate, the intensity, and the profound aversion. I wonder if there is not something that is sacrificed there that is fundamental to man's relationship to his fellow man, but also to himself, since we are about to get into shortly the effects that spewing hatred out into the world. We're not prompted to consider exactly where the hatred goes. We're prompted to consider that this happens, but then we are prompted to reflect on the inward dimension and how the expression of such a thing may impact the inner structure. Now, what I find interesting is to think that the expression itself involves a deceit. The expression of hate, I should say, involves deceit. And so there's one problem that we have to solve. The second is imagining this thing, this monstrous thing that is within us, that lies perhaps within a darkened corner of the room. I think of these contemporary scary movies with all the jump scares, and every once in a while you get a scene in one of these movies that has a scary figure hidden in the corner, but the protagonist doesn't know anything about it, but the audience likely does. because they're observing the surroundings. And then eventually, this scary thing in the background either recedes into further darkness or pops out of the darkness and scares the audience and also the protagonist. So in this way, I think about deceit that's hiding up there in the corner. So of the first situation that we have here, of the potential lie that is committed with the expression of hate, I would say that it is not true in every situation that turning away from something that is repulsive is bad. Nor would I say that the turning away from something rather intensely or rapidly because of the dislike of something is bad. Now that's approaching the definition of hate. But just because I turn myself away from something in an intense aversion doesn't mean I hate it. I could turn myself away from a situation. I think of the situation in Israel, in Gaza. I think of the situation that is developing into a broader regional conflict with Iran and all of the various puppet principalities that are established, one among them being Hamas in Gaza. But in this situation, I can imagine many terrible things in which normal people that don't have much say in the matter are caught up in it. And they may find themselves in extremely adverse circumstances where they wish not to engage, they turn away from a dead body, they turn away from a scene of death, and they run from it. They want to move away from it as far and as fast as they can. But this is not hate. Hate is something that stays. But even running away from a traumatic situation, can cause a stay, can cause a memory to stick, a traumatic memory. But again, this is not hate. I think of a situation in which the positivity is stripped, and what remains is the negativity. But again, I could say that what positivity can be said of a traumatic situation, witnessing the execution of somebody, for example, behind a building wall? Well, we could say that the escape from such a situation is positive. We could say that it is positive that the witness of this situation did not know the individual that was killed, that was put to death. The situation becomes a bit different, though, when the witness is observing a loved one that is being put to death by some enemy or by some assailant. In this sense, a robbery is being committed. A bond is being broken by a foreign agent. And now what stays is the memory, but also the possibility of something. The potential occurs by which a doorway opens. And it is possible for the witness to step through this threshold. That threshold, I think, involves revenge. But it's more than just revenge. I think there's something deeper that this person is being tempted into. Now we can go back to our previous training in these matters, and matters of evil, and to some degree in matters of wickedness, and to a lesser extent matters of the foolish. The intent of evil is to draw one in to a particular disposition, a belief that something ought to be wrought up, out, and away from, to be completely diminished, as the verse says here, disassembled. The identity ought to be destroyed from something to complete nothingness. to be brought down to a state of insignificance from a place that is higher. And I think it is because of this principle at the heart of that experience, while although it may be the case, as I've said, running with an intense or an extreme aversion away from some event or person doesn't mean that there is hate there. But once that aversion takes place, the mind wishes to move away, but perhaps the course of action, even if they do move away physically, is to return to it, to completely dismantle and demolish it. Now, it could also be said that a person could wish to demolish something, to take away something, to reduce the identity of something, and not necessarily have an extreme aversion to it, but rather feel morally justified in doing such a thing. I wouldn't say that this is hate. It would probably be classified as something else. Consequences would probably be somewhat similar and difficult to deal with. It can also be said that disassembling something doesn't imply implicit negativity. There has to be certain constraints that are placed on this, because if we refer to the 10 Commandments, we see thou shalt not murder, not necessarily thou shalt not kill. Killing is an unfortunate situation. It involves an intense disassembly of the individual and of that physical person and of the mental identity that's embodied in the physical form. But there are ways in which, at least perhaps in the human mind and the human conception, that it is justifiable. Not in very many situations, but in some. But in the case of murder, which occupies probably most of the situations in which a person's identity would be completely dissolved or diminished, this sort of thing would be considered wrong. And if we go back to our specific circumstance here, of a person witnessing a murder of a family member, but then the response of such a thing to revenge and the desire to commit the same act, or worse, to commit the act not so that the act will never be committed by that person again, to dissolve the innocence of the community, but rather because the desire of the person that was the witness to such an event wishes to dissolve the identity of that person for the sake of that person's identity, because they wish it not to be in existence anymore. This sort of thing I would consider to be hateful. And I think this would be wrong. Although I can't say that if I found myself in such a situation that I would not have similar feelings. So it's a new day today. It happens to be a Wednesday evening. A full day of work is done and over with. So there was one thing about yesterday's recording that had stuck with me. In fact, I was thinking about it at lunch today. It was that image about the deceit that was stuck up in the corner. Again, that analogy to the common motif in the modern horror movie, those jump scares. And I thought about this thing sitting there so ominously. And as I sat in the room, I felt like I could feel it. I could feel that deceit. Not necessarily because I was speaking hate such that it was dissembling identities around me or anything, but more so because I was thinking about it the day prior. And so this is where I would like to start. Now, the image was a good placeholder. It's a good placeholder because, in some sense, it is a useful image, but not an incomplete one. When we think about deceit, when I think about deceit, I think of a misrepresentation of the truth. There is a lie that is told, a misleading, moving away from that which is true and identifiable. Moving towards chaos, perhaps we can say. Now, the reason that I don't necessarily like the analogy of the jump scare, and I don't think that I had originally relayed it to indicate that this thing would be the image that I would use moving forward, but rather just sort of, like I mentioned, a placeholder. But the reason that I don't necessarily like that image in totality is because the individual in question is utilizing deceit as a tool. And so they won't necessarily put this deceit up in the corner somewhere away from the conscious experience of that person, of that agent. They are, as I've mentioned yesterday, they're using it as a pen, putting it in their pocket for use at some later point. After all, I had mentioned that to lay something up is to put it away, to recognize its purpose, and to put it away for some future use, for some use case that is certain to happen, or expected to happen, or highly probable to happen. And so the very mechanism by which we transmit information verbally, our person of concern here is using this tool of deceit, deception, the lie, the pulling away, the tempting away from truth, to cover the eyes of the individual that they are speaking with. I think of a situation in which a person would want to get revenge on somebody else. The passion that drives them, the tool of deceit that they use to penetrate their inner circle, and then to enact their plans, to execute that disassembling of identity upon them. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. So just as I was saying, this idea of a person that is going for revenge, that their heart is filled with this hate, that they use whatever they can in order to get in the good graces of somebody, but it is because they get past the outer defenses that then the inner workings of the individual is now vulnerable to attack. It's that Trojan horse play. And once the hateful heart, the hateful person is inside those defenses and those walls, it will then unleash what is within it upon everything else and destroy it, make it hateful, or just generally dismantle it, move it away from understanding, make an individual unable to interpret the fundamentals. Now, when I think of the word fair, or to speak fairly, in my mind what comes up is a sense of justice. In order for one to be just, there must be this process, a mechanism by which the mind comes to understand that which is true. And such a mind, given the capacity to understand that which is true, but then to subtly tempt one away from that pillar, is such an insidious thing. It is quite an intelligent mind, I think, that has the capacity to do such a thing. Because again, it is one that recognizes what justice is. The sense of fairness is there to them. They're able to see it, to participate with it. But they choose to deny it for some different end. The altar that they sacrifice to is not the one of ultimate goodness, but of their own desire, of hatred perhaps. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. So this is not the first time that we've seen this sort of thing, the number 7 referred to in the Proverbs. Now I have a difficult time understanding exactly what is meant by this. Obviously there's something significant about the word 7. In fact, I think earlier on in this chapter, the number 7 is used. In verse 16, the sluggard is wiser in his own conceit than 7 men that can render a reason. Now when I interpreted this verse, I spent a lot of time on the sluggard, wise, conceit, reason, but I never really explored the meaning of that number 7. It didn't seem to me then that there was anything that I can go off of to explain the significance of it. And I sort of feel the same here. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. So what we can do to potentially solve this is to think of 7 items that would constitute what we see here. And what I mean by that is this person has hate in their heart. Of hate we can, just as we have before, we can examine of a principal identity. We can imagine 7 pillars that make up this thing. Of course, I would be arbitrarily assigning things. I suppose there would be some reason, because I would try my best to give each pillar some significance such that it can hold the identity of hate. It would give me a better definition, perhaps, by the end of that exercise. But the recurring theme of the number 7 is not something that I think has, at least at this time, logical consistency. Now, I recognize that the number 7 is significant in the Bible. In Genesis, the world is created in 7 days. Or at least that generative process occurs over a period of 7 days. Even that period of rest. But it doesn't seem to me to be immediately clear if that is something that we can draw into this verse. Now it is possible, I suppose, that we can take each one of those 7 days and we can draw some parallel, some twisted parallel to the abomination, perhaps an opposite of each one of these. So let's try to do that, to draw such a parallel. Starting with number 1, the first day. Light and darkness are created. Let there be light. Light is separated from darkness. Naming of light, day, and darkness, night. So these are the type of patterns that I am beginning to be quite energized by. When I say beginning, what I mean is when I reviewed that last bit of recording, and now understanding that I'm entering into this new space of exploring Genesis and its relationship to this verse, establishing an overarching pattern back to this. While at once I was a bit uncertain how this would happen, and even earlier on in the chapter I had neglected to make the adequate comparison, I'm now starting to think that I think this might be quite fruitful as an exercise. So again, day 1, light and dark. Light and darkness are created. So I should mention that today is a new day, so it's going to take me a little bit of time to get back up to speed here. In this segment, it may be a bit atypical for anybody who finds themselves listening this far into a podcast that at once can be characterized by mental masturbation, but also hopefully a degree of self-improvement, and also coming to some broader understanding of the meaning of our experience, of how to improve our experience here while we have this self-identity to continue it, and as it is expressed in this physical form. He that hates disassembles with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. And so what we are after here is to explore the converse, the flip side of creation. Because the abomination is a word that comes from Latin roots, like many words, many of our English words. It comes from the Latin abominatio, which is derived from the verb abominare, composed of that prefix ab, meaning away from or off, and omenare, meaning to foretell, to prophesy, or an omen. Over time, the meaning evolved to express something that is considered loathsome, detestable, offensive to moral standards. But that root doesn't go away because of the detestableness, the loathsomeness. It really only makes sense because of the fact that something is moving away from something that is good, or something that would otherwise cause us to consider the converse of something that is detestable, right? I tend to be sort of an aesthetic person, maybe to my detriment, but just thinking about things that are attractive to look at. I could pick up my phone, for example, and there are certain things that I can examine about this phone aesthetically that are quite pleasing. I suppose there are a few that I can examine that are not so. But of the things that I can identify that are pleasing, and the things that I identify that are pleasing that are generally common among people, and we could say maybe symmetry is among that which is common among people. If the iPhone had all sorts of twists and curves to it and sharp angles, it would make the purpose, the utility of the device a bit difficult and aesthetically a bit off. It would be different, but it would only be different for different sake. And that wouldn't be necessarily sufficient to hold most people's aesthetic sensibilities. Now, I think what we are approaching here is an expanded idea of what the heart is. For if it is possible to have 7 abominations within the heart, then I suppose we can also be thinking about the heart in a state that is other than the hateful, we could say that in a normal state, or in a state of faithfulness, which is not necessarily normal, perhaps, depending on the age or the population. But let's say if we are going to take the good route, the good characterization of what the heart can be, if we imagine these 7 pillars to exist within the heart as an extension of the philosophy, the metaphysics of Genesis, then I wonder where the image of the heart would lead us, how we can expand it, or how I can expand it from the image that I've been traditionally using, that of this industrial factory. But it's, of course, just more than that. It's the seat of our desires, our feelings. That productive capacity leads to the image of the factory as a degree of its own agency. And there's an AI-generated image on my podcast somewhere. I can't remember where exactly, but it's a heart, but there's a face on it, and then there's some gears. And I think it's kind of an interesting image that combines that physical structure of the heart, but also the obvious minded representation that we're always referring to. But anyway, so there's a few different paths that we can go down here, and these are quite large paths. And keeping in mind that we are on day 1 of this situation here, either we go down the abomination, or we go down the normal or good path of the heart, and what these pillars, the 7-day pillars, may provide us. And I think that we should go down both. So this may turn into somewhat of a long project to come to an adequate image of the good heart, the good 7 pillars, but also explore what this verse is prompting us to reflect on, which is, when he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. So again, back to this day 1. Light and darkness are created. Light is separated from darkness. So we have to imagine this landscape that's in front of us. For whatever reason, my mind goes to, and perhaps this is my spiritual adolescence that does this, I'm not really sure, but my mind goes to this. There's 2 places it goes, usually. Either it's a wide open plain, a prairie, which is quite similar actually to another image on the podcast. There's this hill, and there's the trees that surround the hill. I can't remember if there's a house on top of it or not. I think there is. But I feel like I've seen this image so many times. I feel like I've seen it in my own life when I've been hiking, and I feel like I see it all the time when I go to this space when I want to be productive and creative. The other space that I see is just blackness. It's like the image of outer space. Maybe there's some things in there, like stars out in the distance, but the immediate sense of it is just black. It's not black in terms of nothingness or negativity. It's black because it's unexplored territory or unenvisioned territory. The light has yet to permeate it and to produce things that are intelligible. And these 2 images, I would say, are born of a lot of reflection on the earlier books of the Bible. The psalmists, I think, do a good job at outlining the mental domain, mental sphere. Of course, the Proverbs do this well as well. Now, I think that there is a significance to these 2 images. In the first situation, we have darkness that permeates that which is in front of our sight. Everything that we are, or that is behind us, perhaps we can say, is that which is created. The new landscape that is before us here is something uncreated, but given to us to create nonetheless. In the former image, in the image of the house on the hill, the prairie, this is an image that includes a lot of material. It includes a lot of things for which a physical being can take under his wing of perception, of understanding, so he can use it for some purpose. An abundant sandbox just for him and his kind. And so I like the image of the prairie again because it's open. It's there in the material sense for the human being to explore, to be amazed, to be surprised, to be set to wonder. But in all of these situations, in both of these situations, what we have is, well, what do we have? We have an agent that is looking out across the landscapes, both of these landscapes. An agent that has a particular capacity to do something, to create something. Creation, or the capacity to do it, is in his mind unrivaled. It is unmatched. The mind is something that is fascinating to him, and while there may be other beings on the planet that express it, that express mindedness, do not have it to the degree that he does. He may find himself alone in that experience. But regardless of how he may find it, the ability of that mindedness to find itself in such a place to understand not only itself, but also its potential purpose. We don't even have to go that far. We can examine potential purposes that he may not think very much about, his behavior or his goals, and yet implicitly he acts as if he has some purpose or he finds value in some end. Now, I'd say that this sort of experience is more animalistic than that of the agent that recognizes his station or his position and looks out across the landscape and is ready to move forward, to express something that is deep within him. It is deep within him, but it is not belonging to him. It is something that is provided him, something that is given to him. It is almost, in a sense, the harnessing of that unknown or that implicit understanding of things, such that he has arrived somewhere, at some point, at some time, in some reality. It happens to be some physical substructure. It happens to be, in the paraphrased words of Forrest Gump, it seems to be a bit of a mixture between the petals, maybe we would say, or the seeds of a dandelion that are just whisked up in some breeze, and that of something more certain, destined, enacted. It would seem that man has the choice what experience he wants to be involved in. Both are open to the mind. Both the mind can see, and both the mind can believe. But where are we in terms of answering the question, what is light? Well, it would seem that there is something in our vision. And when I say our vision, I mean our capacity. Our capacity in general extends beyond the physical perception of seeing. It bleeds into one of the domains that I had mentioned earlier, the implicit seeing, the seeing of mind. For the seeing of mind is the very thing that allows or puts forth the principles that are necessary to build in the world, to manifest man's physical purposes. They are through his sight and through his vision. And there is something here, and I will say, as an aside, that even though I had mentioned and perhaps brushed off the physical perception of sight as something that might be trivial compared to the mind, and although I suppose it's possible to make the argument, I don't necessarily wish to make that argument. I wish to make the argument that the entire interface is important. The being that interfaces at this level, the being that finds himself plugged in, if we can use such an analogy, plugged in such a strange environment with such a strange set of constraints. But I suppose we should ask the question, well, why is it strange? Why is there something about examining our station that becomes unsettling, hard to understand, unfamiliar, almost as if the mind understands something that is familiar, like it found itself in a white room, and yet in that white room there is a couch. Now he found himself in this room. He knew not that there was anything else in the room until he found this couch. But now he understands that there is something. There's something that he can interact with. It's fit for his purpose. Something had left it there. In the same, or in a like manner, the earth is left for him. Physical reality is left for him. And it's easy for him to get caught up, once he finds the couch, in the warmth of its embrace and the convenience that at times it can provide him as long as he is disciplined. And it's easy to be blinded by comfort once he has found that part of the couch that has offered him rest. Whereas before, the couch was this perhaps island in a broader, unexplored territory. And it's also easy to imagine, within this space, the potential for other agents that are out there, that exist, that participate within the same realm that he does. And it's not to say that this image is somehow false or poor to wonder about, but rather it is a distraction from what our goal is. It is a distraction from imagining a causeway between the agent that found himself in the whitened territory, that found himself thrown into existence itself, with an awareness, an innate sense that something has caused him to be. But what matters is not the material cause that caused him to be, but rather the state that he found when he woke up. meaning the state of mind that he found, that there was something of the material world that has given birth to an agent that is able to reflect on itself, but also from its origins, understanding that of the playground or the sandbox that his mind operates in, the sand itself is not sufficient to explain his experience, or again, his existence. But there's something too light about this characterization. Light in terms of the opposite of being weighted. It's like a feather. It needs a further grounding and solidification for it to stick in the reasoned mind. For of man's own identity, I think it could be said that there is more than just one thing. There's more than just one identity. Now there is a unifying and principled identity that controls the multitude. Now, in this situation, I think of not only the pillars of mind, and we have to remember that we are talking about a pillar of the heart here, one of the 7 that we are prompted to consider the first day, the separation between light and darkness that occurs within the heart. But I also consider those aspects of man's identity that are beneath the minded sphere, the parts of him that make up what many of us would classify as the lesser identities, that of the cells that execute their own purposes, that behave in such a way to facilitate the body's interworkings and internal composition, and that of that aspect of the entire conversation of man's will as it can be had, I think of how much of this is constrained by those elements beneath the minded sphere. How much information is wrapped up within his genetics, wrapped up in the circumstance between the interaction of the individual and the environment. But of course, as I've mentioned before, this aspect of will, and I think ultimately the expression of that freedom of will, comes in the minded sphere. It comes in the sense that we can either accept a faith in something that has an orderly description of things, and I don't just mean the natural world of earthly sorts, I mean of all thingness, of everything that can be identified, that there is some principled source of it, and that man has access, at least to a very small part. The way in which the minded sphere transcends what we understand to be all that we know, our physical substructure. Now, going back to this question of what it necessarily means to say something that is light and say something that is darkness. Now, I think here it must be said that we are using physical phenomena, we are using anecdotes of our experience to describe a different aspect of our experience, a more fundamental existential aspect of our experience. And so light and dark, it's easy to imagine the image of such things, but its meaning permeates in different directions. It is not just restricted to the physical senses. Likewise, my mind is quick to understand that the light and darkness separation occupies this space. But the very fact that there is a day that is mentioned, I think also needs to be abstracted to a degree, away from the rising and the falling of the sun, which again gives us an appropriate image of what is occurring, but we have to extend this image into the philosophical domain. And there's another distinction that I think is quite important. The word day is used to describe the first day. This first day encapsulates the pillar number 1. Of a day, there's a beginning and there's an ending. I think that to a degree there's a lot of fruitful territory here. We can imagine this as being, at least individually, the beginning of life and the ending of life, where the consciousness, the light of the conscious mind permeates the physical domain and then is reduced once the process of aging has come to pass. And there's an entire process there that unfolds into human intellectual maturity. But we experience this day, for it is our life. We experience individual days in which we are faced with difficult problems, or we are exposed to certain things that make us think in certain ways, reflect on things, interact with people. Our interactions we deem as positive or negative. We find all sorts of experiences that give us this sense of that which is light and that which is dark. There are periods in my life. We can look at many different scales, as I've mentioned. A day, a month, a year, decades, that we can identify and characterize as different types of experiences, different periods of life. Of these, we can also, I think, say some are lighter and some are darker than others. There is cast a shadow over an experience, just as it may be cast over a physical object. And of course, these words mimic the physical sense of experiencing such a thing, of darkness. As I look into my cubby in front of me, the light from my reading lamp permeates a few papers that are exposed at the edge, but it extends deep enough back to where the darkness that is there, or that the light that exists, is unable to penetrate that far back, and I'm unable to identify anything that is behind it, behind the veil of that darkness. That doesn't mean that there's nothing there, of course. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm unable to identify it. And so we have our first, maybe not our first, but at least explicit definition of what we can consider light and darkness. In the light, we are able to identify. In the darkness, we do not have that faculty. And as far as I've mentioned, the self being this conglomeration of elements, of pieces that are joined together to form the centralized identity, this light and dark experience can find itself deeply embedded within the central identity, the light in which the pieces are well organized and harmonious together. The individual is disciplined, the physical body is healthy, the attention is keen, it's sharp, focused. Its purpose is clear, and its emotions stable. The self's influence over the direction of life is tempered and is open to information from others. In this business of darkness, in the Proverbs, my reflection on them at least, I've come back repeatedly to the idea that I don't much like separating the physical reality from the rest of reality, or the minded reality, we could say. Or at least some conception or faith in a world that is broader than the physical structure that we can observe. And I don't necessarily, again, it's so ingrained into our minds, at least into my mind, to see these things as separate, that bringing them together is quite difficult. For just fathoming what lies beyond that which is twists the mind something strange. For the mind, likely, in the contemporary era, goes to the idea of the universe and its expanse, and we think of what is inside or outside of the universe. But of course, the inside and the outside must necessarily communicate. Otherwise, the identity cannot be. My identity cannot exist independent of anything else, any other input, just like my cells of my body cannot survive given a lack of blood flow or oxygen, or essential nutrients for that matter. Identities depend to a degree on relationships. Now, I think I'm going to end this episode here. It's getting a bit long, but I'll continue next time with this verse.